Good morning to everyone. It's nice to be here in your presence. Can everybody hear me okay? A little bit louder? Okay, thank you. My name is Amy Zoe Schonhoff, and I'm really grateful to be here with you all. When Victor provided me the opportunity to come and speak with you all, I knew that one of the things I wanted to talk about was talking about trauma, and particularly meeting trauma on the cushion in our formal practice, but both for personal reasons, because I have a fairly extensive trauma history of my own and have met my own challenges in my practice over the years, and also as a teacher of mindfulness and meditation. I think it's really important that we're having conversations about how trauma may affect our ability to show up on the cushion, and how we may need to meet ourselves in ways that are nurturing and supportive and honor where we're at. So it was really important for me to use this time in this space to begin a conversation and hopefully provide you with information that might be useful to you. So the first thing I want to do is, and this is probably not going to go like a typical Dharma talk. I'm here to really hopefully provide you with information, but in the context of formal practice, okay? So I'd like to begin first by defining what a traumatic event is, and I'm going to rely on the American Psychiatric Association's definition. They say a trauma event is defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. Such exposure can result from directly experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event, or learning that the event occurred to a family member or close friend. It can also arise through repeated or extreme exposure to the details of trauma, including in the context of one's work. So within this definition, it really talks about multiple types of trauma that we can experience in our human experience. One is an acute experience, like one event that is traumatic and overwhelming as an event of trauma. Trauma can also be chronic and occur over time. So we can be in an environment that's chronically traumatic for us. There's also what they orient towards this idea of secondary trauma, that just vicariously through being exposed to people who've had traumatic experiences, we can take on trauma. And that becomes important in terms of people who work as first responders, who work in medical professions, people who, the people who rush in when trauma occurs. Those people can also experience trauma vicariously through the work that they do. But there's not so obvious forms of trauma that I think need to be spoken to as well. And that has to do with people who walk through their lives as part of a marginalized community. There are systems of oppression that exist in our culture that have direct impact on people based on their sexual orientation or their gender orientation or the color of their skin, their socioeconomic status, our religion, our religious practices, our native languages or our places of origin. There are lots of places where we can systematically experience trauma, where there's a chronic sense of not feeling safe that can create trauma for people. So I think it's important to have that orientation and recognizing that all of that comes to the cushion. All of our experience as a human being comes to rest on the cushion. And so trauma can look like a lot of things, okay? It's not just what we typically think of in terms of trauma. It can look a lot of ways. And to talk in terms of how much trauma there is in our culture, it's estimated that 90% of us will experience a traumatic event in our lifetimes. 90%, right? And for 8 to 20%, that's an estimation, for 8 to 20% of us, that traumatic event or a chronic experience of trauma will lead to what's referred to as post-traumatic stress. So that the stress is not just a one-time experience, that it's perhaps an event or multiple events that are really difficult to integrate. So we're walking around in traumatized bodies with traumatized nervous systems that have an impact on how we orient towards our lives. There's a gentleman by the name of Bessel van der Kolk. He is a psychiatrist by training, but he's done a great deal of research in the area of trauma. And I just want to read this quote to you from him. He's written a book called The Body Keeps the Score that I think is really insightful in regards to trauma and trauma recovery. He writes, "We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on the mind, brain, and body. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and the brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. So we can be changed in really fundamental ways by the experiences of trauma." And it's important to keep that in mind when we're considering our seat on the cushion. And this path can be a very attractive path. The Buddhist path is a very attractive path when you think in terms of the Four Noble Truths, right? We're offered a cessation of suffering, that there is a way out, that there is a path out. There's a way to get out of the space of suffering. But for people who have experienced post-traumatic stress, who are living with the trauma in their bodies, in their nervous systems, in how their brains process and how they think, there's another side to that coin in terms of what happens when we take our seat on the cushion. Because people who live in traumatized bodies and have traumatized minds are constantly living in an internal world that does not feel safe, right? We walk around with a chronic sense of not having safety. And when we're learning the formal practices of mindful awareness, what are we asking people to do? To bring awareness to their physical body, to sensations occurring in their body, to noticing how their thought processes occur, right? To notice emotion. So for a person who has trauma, orienting and cultivating mindful awareness can be very disorienting and very overwhelming. And so there needs to be consideration for how we approach the work we do on the cushion. Now, a lot of times, kind of the refrain that we hear in the Dharma community when we're meeting discomfort is to continue to sit, right? To sit in the discomfort, and that it will shift and change. And that may be true, but for a person who's had a lot of trauma, that can be just a process of re-traumatization. It can be putting a person in the place of re-experiencing trauma. So for those people, we potentially need to modify and adapt our practice. And so I want to offer some ideas for how that might look. Yep. So one thing in my teaching that I introduce people to is something called the window of tolerance, okay? And this comes out of the behavioral sciences, so I apologize if this feels really clinical, but the intent here, once again, is to be helpful. So if you think about this is all about recognizing arousal within the body, because arousal in the body is what activates the autonomic nervous system. It's what moves us into fight or flight or into a freeze response. So this is a tool basically that I offer to people when I'm teaching them mindfulness and meditation so that they have a way to self-monitor as they're practicing. So if you think about the window of tolerance as that area in green, that is the area where we can feel balanced, where we feel like we can self-regulate, where we feel a sense of alertness and engagement with what we're doing, but we're also relaxed. Now, that doesn't mean when we're in this window of tolerance that we're not feeling moments of discomfort, okay? I talk a lot when I'm teaching about working at the edges of our practice. So we can work at the edges and feel discomfort without moving into spaces of dysregulation. So the window of tolerance is allowing space for discomfort, but not getting us to a point of being dysregulated, right? So the areas outside of that window of tolerance are areas where arousal has there's either too much arousal or not enough arousal. So when there's too much, we refer to that as hyperarousal. And what that can feel like or look like is agitation, physical agitation within the body. It can be like a lot of mental rumination, intrusive thoughts. It can be feeling overstimulated by sensory information coming into the body or within the body. And then also, let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything here. The thinking can get disorganized. We can start to feel confused. There's just a general sense of being overwhelmed. So that's hyperarousal. So when we recognize that, we're noticing that we're outside of this window of tolerance. And then on the other end of the spectrum is what we refer to as hypoarousal, and that's when there's not enough energy. So what that can look like is feeling really lethargic. That can look like feeling numb, like not being able to tap into physical sensation or emotion. We can feel foggy or spacey in our thinking. Okay, that might be an indication that we've moved into hypoarousal. So the benefit of learning about this window of tolerance, and this is something that's available to all of us, whether we have a trauma history or not, is learning when we're working skillfully on the cushion and and perhaps taking measures to modify how we're practicing if we're moving outside of that space, that window of tolerance. The other benefit of the window of tolerance, for people who have trauma, they tend to have a really small window of tolerance. They can't deal with a lot of hyper or hypoarousal. That if they feel a great deal of discomfort, they'll move into those extremes really quickly. So what this provides them the opportunity to do is to slowly over time and through adapting practice to open this window of tolerance so that over time they can feel more discomfort without being overwhelmed, without being triggered. Hopefully that makes sense to you all. But this is a way of orienting towards our practice on the cushion that can be helpful to us whether we have a trauma history or not. And so I'd like to offer as well some suggestions for when we're feeling discomfort that feels like too much in our practice. Some things that we can do to support ourselves that are modifications to our practice. So we went through, when we started our practice today, I gave you the option of having your eyes open or closed. For people who have trauma, having your eyes closed can be overwhelming. So if any time when we're practicing and we start to feel a sense of being overwhelmed, we can open our eyes and orient towards our external environment. We can just keep our eyes open when we practice in general if we need to. We can take structured breaks within our practice. So if we're sitting on the cushion and we're starting to feel agitated or recognize that we're moving into hyperarousal or hypoarousal, then we can alter our practice by getting up off the cushion and doing something different. That can be like structured walking meditation. That can be some mindful movement or stretching. But it can also be an unstructured break. It's perhaps just recognizing that we need to do something different because we're not operating in a state that's conducive to practice. We can also do soothing forms of self-touch. So sometimes it might be helpful to like place our hands on our chest while we're practicing and just feel the touch, feel into the body, right? We can also provide some massage to ourselves as we practice, feeling areas of tension in the body and providing some therapeutic touch to ourselves. And we can also just choose to take shorter practice periods. If we find that 30 minutes of practice overwhelms us, then we can do 20 minutes. If 20 minutes of practice overwhelms us, we can do 10 minutes. And the thing is, over time, we can learn to sit longer. Like I said, opening that window of tolerance, which is just another word for equanimity, right? Finding balance, finding a way to stay balanced in our practice. Another way we can orient is by shifting attention. So we started our practice today doing some grounding practices, which are alternatives for the focus of our attention when we're practicing. A lot of times we'll be asked to focus our attention on the breath. Well, for a person who's experienced trauma, the breath may be a source of anxiety. So we can open our ears to sound instead. If we're practicing with the breath and we find that we're getting dysregulated, we can feel sensation in the hands instead, or notice sensation in the feet. So there are ways that we can shift our attention to help soothe ourselves as we're on the cushion practicing. And this is by no means, this list of options is by no means like in totality. There are lots of different ways that you can learn to work in your practice in a way that's supportive for you. And for some people, sitting on the cushion is not the first place to begin mindfulness practice. For some people, movement is a better gateway into formal practice. So that could be things like practicing Tai Chi or Qigong or mindful movement. That those may be sources of practice that are more fruitful for beginning a formal meditation practice. The other thing that I think is really key in working with trauma on the cushion is the heart-centered practices that we learn. And specifically, I'm speaking here about loving kindness, metta, or compassion practices, and directing those practices towards ourselves. Speaking from personal experience, there were many years that I was on the cushion really white-knuckling myself through it. And I wasn't gaining the insight that I gained when I really started to orient my practice towards loving kindness towards myself. Because like many people, my internal world was not safe. It was not a place that felt supportive. And I think a lot of people who suffer with trauma walk around as well with a lot of shame and a lot of fear, chronic fear. So for me, loving kindness practices, particularly dedicated to myself, really focusing on loving kindness towards myself, started to help to create an internal environment for me that really allowed for some major shifts in how I was orienting towards myself and my practice. About 6 years ago, I took a year of practice and just focused on loving kindness. And although I would say it was a year of 1,000 sorrows, it was also a year of great transformation for me in terms of giving myself the space, the internal environment that was benevolent, loving, and supportive so that I could start to integrate my experiences. So it was critical for me, and I believe many people with trauma need to also cultivate this internal world that feels safe, safe to approach and safe to be present with things that may feel overwhelming. Additionally, self-compassion practices in the moment of suffering. Self-compassion is all about meeting the moments of suffering with kindness. So recognizing that suffering is occurring, being aware that we're in a place of suffering. And recognizing as well that suffering is a universal experience. It's part of the deal of being human. So knowing that we're not alone when we suffer, right? It's just the phenomenon of being human. And then finally offering ourselves words of encouragement, phrases of care and concern when we're suffering. I think the strongest, most powerful words I ever said to myself is, I'm here for you. I'm here. I will never abandon you. And people who suffer with trauma need to hear that. And we need to give that to ourselves. We need to be here for ourselves. I knew I wasn't going to get through that last line because every time I practiced it, I choked up, so I apologize. But people who have survived trauma, we need to be here for ourselves. We need to not abandon ourselves. Okay? So, self-compassion, meeting ourselves with compassion, and knowing that this is hard work, but there is a way out. There is freedom. I mean, that is the beauty of this path. There is freedom. There is hope. And it takes effort, but it takes effort that is kind, that is friendly, that is considerate of where we've been and what we've been through. So I encourage you, if you identify yourself as a person who's experienced trauma, to be gentle with yourself, to meet yourself with friendliness. And if you need additional support, to seek it, because there are people that can be helpful to you. So I just want to close with a poem by a man named Darrell F. Mead, and it's called If You Would Grow. If you would grow to your best self, be patient, not demanding, accepting, not condemning, nurturing, not withholding, self-marveling, not belittling, gently guiding, not pushing and punishing. For you are more sensitive than you know. Mankind is as tough as war, yet delicate as flowers. We can endure agonies, but we open fully only to warmth and light. And our need to grow is as fragile as a fragrance dispersed by storms of will, to return only when those storms are still. So accept, respect, and attend your sensitivity. A flower cannot be opened with a hammer.